Welcome to the sixth lecture in Module 6, and in this lecture we'll talk about cascading style sheets. Recall that in the last lecture we described how HTML is dynamically created by Rails and delivered to the browser. Let's take a look at what happens inside the browser. The first thing that happens is any external resources, for example, cascading style sheets or JavaScript files, are retrieved either from the server that the HTML was delivered from or from some other external source. Next, the HTML is parsed to create an internal document tree. And that document tree is referred to as the document object model. Very important to understand that this document object model is the thing that's rendered in your browser. What happens is the cascading style sheet rules and the JavaScript is applied to the elements in the document object model, and then the page is rendered. This is an example of what a document tree might look like. You see at the root is an element called document, and then the HTML tag, a header, a body, and within the body are the various HTML elements that are actually displayed on the page. Let's take a look at how you can view the DOM in your browser. Here's the CSS Zen site. And what's interesting about this site is for all the pages I'm getting ready to show you, the HTML is identical. The only thing that's changing is the cascading style sheet that's read in externally. So let's select a different one. If I select this one, garments, you'll see that the site looks completely different. But if you look, all of the HTML elements on the page are the same. You can select another one here, and you'll see that it's completely different, and continue in this way. So try this out. It's very interesting. If you look at the HTML that's been loaded, so let's pull up the web developer tool, you'll see that everything is the same. If you inspect this HTML file, this is the DOM again. If you inspect the DOM for this page and the previous page I showed you, you'll see that they'll be identical. The only thing that's changing, if you go to the head, you'll see that this file is changing. This style sheet is being read in. Again, let me prove this to you. If we read this in, you'll see that now the style sheet is different. HTML is the same. Very powerful example of what cascading style sheets can do for you in terms of design. Now let's talk a little bit more about cascading style sheets. This is the language for specifying the presentation semantics of an HTML document. In other words, it's what's used to style an HTML document. Now CSS involves creating rules that specify how particular HTML elements should appear in your browser. And in Rails, there's an extension called SAS, which stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets, that's actually used. Now, SAS is actually interpreted into CSS. So if you use CSS in place of SAS, it'll work fine. SAS is a little bit cleaner syntax, so if you'd like to learn it, I've provided a URL for you, but I'm just going to work with CSS for now. A demonstration of how powerful this separation of the content from the presentation that's supported by cascading style sheets is provided at this website called CSS Zen. Let's take a look. Here's the CSS Zen site. And what's interesting about this site is for all the pages I'm getting ready to show you, the HTML is identical. The only thing that's changing is the cascading style sheet that's read in externally. So let's select a different one. If I select this one, garments, you'll see that the site looks completely different. But if you look, all of the HTML elements on the page are the same. You can select another one here, and you'll see that it's completely different, and continue in this way. So try this out. It's very interesting. If you look at the HTML that's been loaded, so let's pull up the web developer tool, you'll see that everything is the same. If you inspect this HTML file, this is the DOM again. If you inspect the DOM for this page and the previous page I showed you, you'll see that they'll be identical. The only thing that's changing, if you go to the head, you'll see that this file is changing. This style sheet is being read in. Again, let me prove this to you. If we read this in, you'll see that now the style sheet is different. HTML is the same. Very powerful example of what cascading style sheets can do for you in terms of design. Now here's how you specify a CSS rule in a CSS file. It's very simple, just a selector, open curly brace, a list of declarations, and close curly brace. The selector itself specifies which elements, which HTML elements, this rule will be applied to. And then the declaration is a semicolon separated list of property value pairs. Let's take a look at an example. And in this example, the selector are H1 and H2. So all level 1 headings and level 2 headings in the document are going to be styled by these rules. And you'll see the open curly brace and then 3 declarations. The first sets the font weight as bold. The second sets the font family as Arial. And the third sets the font itself the color black. And so there's 3 declarations here, and notice that they're separated by semicolons. Now, one thing to understand is that invalid CSS rules are simply ignored. So sometimes when you're trying to style a document and things aren't changing, recognize that the browser, if it can't understand what you're trying to do with the CSS, simply ignores it. Now think back to the class attribute that we said could be associated with almost any HTML element. Here's an example. We're creating a division in the document, and I'm saying that it has class main. And remember, for the class attribute for an HTML element, we can apply it to many different elements. If I want to style that element, then here's how I do it. I use the class selector. And the class selector is the dot. So here I have div.main. I could leave the div off and just say .main, and then everything with class main would be styled. In this case, only those divs that have class main will be styled. And here I'm setting the background color to white, and then the font family to use Arial. If Arial's not available, use the Verdana font, and otherwise use sans serif. So as we've seen, selectors allow you to specify the HTML elements that particular CSS rules get applied to. So I showed you how to do it with the class selector. There's also type selectors, and I actually showed you that one as well. In this case, every particular HTML element type has this rule applied to it. So here's one. Again, I'm setting H1 color to purple, so every single H1 element in the document would be colored purple in this case. Here, the second one is a level 2 heading, and the bold selector will be colored red. There's also a class selector, and I've showed you this one, right? So type selector, class selector. Here's 2 ways you can apply it. P.main means that all paragraph elements with class main will be styled in the way that I've shown. And the second one, all elements with class main will be styled in the way that I've shown. There's also an ID selector. Remember, IDs within a document, an HTML document, have to be unique. And the ID selector is the hash symbol that I show there. So in this case, the element that has ID chapter 1 will be text-aligned centered. And that's what this rule specifies. If you'd like to look at a list of all the various selectors that are available to you, go to the w3schools.site and take a look. Here's the URL. Now there's one more thing that you'll see in CSS files, and these are called pseudo classes. These don't apply to particular elements, but they more apply to concepts. So for example, if a link has been visited, you'll see in web pages it's often colored differently. And this is how you specify this in CSS. So here's an example that says all anchors that are links, color them this particular color that I show you here. And when you use a color with a hash symbol like this, this indicates that it's a hexadecimal value. You can color visited links as in the manner I showed you here. If you hover over an element, you could change its color as well. Now it's important to recognize that CSS treats every HTML element as a box. So this white box here, let's assume that that's the content of a particular HTML element. For example, it could be the H1 header, and this would be the actual value that's printed for that header. Around that element, you can place padding. And here you can specify padding top, bottom, left, or right. And you specify this as a CSS rule. You can also place a border around the element, and that's what I've shown in yellow here. And then you can specify a margin as well. Again, margin top, bottom, left, and right can be specified as part of a CSS rule. Now, every box has a border, even if it's not visible. In this case, I'm showing it as that thin yellow line here. There are additional properties associated with the border. You can style it, for example, make it dashed or something like that. You can set its width and you can set its color. Here's an example of how you can set these properties and space the various HTML elements on your page out using the padding and the margin elements. So here's an example. I specified that an H1 element, an image, and the bold element will have border style solid, so there'll be a solid border around these elements that's 2 pixels wide. The third rule says that the color is going to be white, and finally there's going to be a padding of 2 pixels on all 4 sides. If you just use padding as I show you here, it assumes it's applied to all 4 sides. There's a second rule below where I show H1 and B having the background color all C's, whatever color that turns out to be. So as I mentioned, this puts a 2 pixel black border around the H1 image and B elements, and the background of H1 and B elements are going to be gray in this case. That's what the all C's means. Now finally, cascading style sheet rules can be used to control the positioning of these boxes on the page. In other words, the layout of your application. And this is specified using the position property. It allows you to finally control the position of every div, in fact, every HTML element in your document. Now, in the past, it was very common to use tables or iframes to do this positioning, but that's kind of fallen out of favor. It's better to use these positioning properties. Now, we really don't have time to cover all of these in detail. I just want you to be aware that this is the typical way of specifying a layout. But if you take a look at these 2 URLs that I've provided for you, they give a very good tutorial on how to position the elements in a web page using cascading style sheet rules. Let's take a look at how cascading style sheets are used in Rails. Let's take a look at how Rails handles cascading style sheets. So this is my blog application, and if you look under the app directory, you'll see a subdirectory called assets. Open that up and you'll see that there's additional subdirectories, one called JavaScripts and another called style sheets. So your JavaScript files will be placed in the first and your CSS style sheets in the second. Let's open that one up and you'll see that there are 4 here: application.css, comments, posts, and scaffolds. So what happens is the application.css is created for you automatically when you create the application. When you run the scaffold generator, it creates the scaffolds.css as well as one for the actual scaffold you built. We built one for posts and another for comments, so they're here. Now the only one that has anything in it is the scaffolds.css. Let's take a look at it. And you see a bunch of CSS rules here. Remember, this is actually the SCSS, but that CSS works here. If you just put CSS, the SCSS accepts that. So if you just want to write CSS here, that's fine. So here it is. This is the cascading style sheet rules that have been defined for our application. Let's take a look at the application itself and see how they're used. So here's the blog app, and let's open up the developer tools. And if we look at the DOM, we're going to look at the head, and we're going to see here, this is where all these cascading style sheets are read in. The 4 of them are read in right here. Below that are some JavaScript files. Now you'll see a thing here called turbolinks. Turbolinks is just something in Rails that was added to make the app more responsive. What happens with turbolinks is the entire, the browser doesn't recompile the JavaScript or the CSS files every time a page is reloaded. So that's what that's for. The main thing to see here is just under Assets, application.css is loaded. Now you can actually experiment with the scaffold.css. Let's select it here, and you can see that the same thing that I showed you previously now shows up here. Let's go back and let's inspect some of the elements. Let me go to this H1 heading, and you'll see over here on the right the style that's being used for this actually shows up. Now the H1 was not defined in any of our style sheets anywhere. But if you go down, you'll see that what was inherited from body, body was defined in your scaffold.css. If you want to play around with how this looks, so I'm going to play around with the color. If I want to change this color, I can do so right here. So let me just change this to a different color, and you'll see that in the browser, that was actually changed. And that's so throughout the document now,
wherever the color of the body was previously the 333, I added 333 FFF, and that creates a blue text. So you can experiment directly in your page in this way, and if you get something that you like, then you can actually go back to your application and add it there. So I'm going to change this back and show you how I can change this in our application CSS file. Let's say that I wanted that color for all of our H1 elements. I could change it in scaffold.css, or I could go to my posts and change it there. So let's pull up post.css, and you'll see there's nothing there at the moment. But if I simply say I want my H1, my first level heading elements, to have a color that's, say, let's make it blue, I can do that here. Let's save this file. Now we're going to go back to the running application, and when I reload, you'll see that the H1 level heading is going to change colors. So here we've actually changed the color in the CSS file. So that's how you can do this in Rails. You can experiment in the application directly through the DOM if you like, and once you find something you like, you can go back to your CSS files in Rails and change them there as well. But which cascading style sheets in Rails should you change? Well, if you'd like the change to occur for every single page in your application, then you would add new rules to the application.css file. If you'd like it to, if you've built everything using the scaffold generator, you achieve essentially the same thing by putting that rule in the scaffold.css file. If you'd like to modify only the pages associated with your posts, then you can add new rules to the post.css.scss file. Or if you'd like the new rules to be applied only to the pages associated with comments, then you would change the comments.css.scss file. It's as simple as that. My advice to you, however, is to keep this as simple as possible.
This completes the 6th lecture in Module 6.